Maureen looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror and didn't recognize the woman looking back at her. Dark circles under her eyes showed she'd spent the night tossing and turning, and she felt guilty and uneasy. She splashed cold water on her face, hoping to wash away the shame of her latest mistake. Gavin called out, "You okay in there, Maureen?" Maureen replied, "I'm fine." She sounded more steady than she felt, just freshening up. Gavin dried her face and stepped out of the bathroom. Gavin stood in the hallway. He seemed like a stranger now, not like the familiar presence he once was. He offered a brief smile that didn't reach his eyes. As he headed to work, he asked, "Have a good day," without even a kiss goodbye or a warm embrace. It was as if they were two people occupying the same space, drifting further apart with each passing day. Maureen's chest tightened as she remembered a time when their mornings were filled with laughter and lingering touches. Now, all that remained was a cold politeness that felt more suffocating than comforting. She grabbed her keys and headed out, the weight of her secret affair pressing down on her shoulders. The drive to work was a blur of suburban scenery and conflicting emotions. The scenery and conflicting emotions were part of her ACH for the safety and stability of her marriage to Gavin. Another part of her was thrilled at the thought of seeing Seth and feeling truly alive again as she pulled into the office parking lot. Her phone buzzed with a text from Seth, "Can't wait to see you launch." Maureen's heart rose as she read it. She quickly replied with a yes and put her phone away, trying to convince herself that everything was normal. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and paperwork. Maureen found herself checking the clock frequently, her anticipation growing as lunchtime approached. When she arrived, she practically ran from her desk. Seth was waiting for her in the small cafe 2 blocks from their office. He looked up and saw her, and Maureen felt a familiar flutter in her stomach. He stood to greet her, pulling her into a warm embrace that lingered just a moment too long for the colleagues around them. "I missed you," he said. "You?" Seth murmured as they sat down. Maureen glanced around nervously before responding, "I missed you too, but we need to be careful." Seth's hand found hers under the table. I know. It's just. Man, you drive me crazy." His touch sent electricity coursing through her veins. Maureen leaned in closer, drinking in the sight. Seth was everything Gavin wasn't: passionate, spontaneous, full of life. He made her feel young again and desired in a way she hadn't felt in years. "We can't keep doing this," Maureen whispered, even as her body betrayed her words. "It's not fair to Gavin." Seth's grip on her hand tightened, then released. "Leave him be with me," Maureen said. "Back to reality. It's not that simple. We have a life together and a home, I can't just throw that away." "But you're not happy," Seth said, his voice low and intense. "I see it in your eyes every day. You're suffocating in that marriage." Tears pricked Maureen's eyes. "I know, but I still care about him. I can't hurt him like that." Seth leaned back, frustration evident in the set of his jaw. "So what if we just keep sneaking around, stealing moments when we can?" "That's not enough for me, Maureen. I want all of you." The waiter arrived with their food, forcing them to pause their heated discussion. Maureen picked at her salad. Her appetite had disappeared. She looked at Seth and saw the passion and desire burning in his eyes, and her resolve was weakening. "Maybe there's another way," she said hesitantly. Seth raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Maureen took a deep breath. What if I asked Gavin for an open marriage?" The words hung in the air between them. Seth's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and hope crossing his face. "Do you think he'd go for that?" he asked Maureen. She shrugged, her mind racing. "I don't know, but it might be a way to have both, to keep my marriage and still be with you." Seth reached across the table, taking her hand openly. "If that's what you want to try, I'll support you. Just know that I'm here for you." Whatever happens, the rest of lunch passed in a blur of whispered plans and stolen kisses. When they parted ways to return to the office, Maureen felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. She'd made her decision that night. She would talk to Gavin. The drive home that evening felt like it took forever. Marin's hands were shaking slightly on the steering wheel as she thought about what she was going to say. How do you ask your husband of 15 years to open up your marriage? She pulled into the driveway and saw Gavin's car already there. Taking a deep breath, Marin stepped out of her car. Marin got out of her car and walked to the front door. The house was quiet as she entered, with the only sound being the TV in the living room. She called out to Gavin, her voice wavering slightly. He replied, and she found him on the couch with a beer, watching some mindless reality show. He glanced up. She stood up as she entered, and saw that he was watching TV. He looked like he was just going through the motions, not really interested. How was your day? He asked, in a way that made it seem like he was just going through the motions. Fine, she replied, automatically. She sat down on the edge of an armchair, feeling nervous. Gavin, can we talk? He said, in a way that made it seem like he was just going through the motions. Sure, what's on your mind? Marin was nervous as she spoke. She had been thinking a lot about their marriage lately. Gavin's posture stiffened slightly. He nodded in agreement. Marin felt like they had drifted apart and that something was missing between them. She continued, her words gaining momentum. They used to be so passionate and connected, but now it felt like they were just going through the motions. Gavin's face remained neutral, which Marin found frustrating. She pressed on, desperation creeping into her voice. She wanted to fix things and feel that spark again, but she also thought they needed something different to shake things up. Marin took a deep breath and asked, "What exactly are you suggesting?" Gavin's tone was carefully controlled. Taking a deep breath, she said, "I want to try an open marriage." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and irretrievable. Marin watched Gavin's face, searching for any reaction to her surprise. He remained oddly calm. "You want us to sleep with other people?" She repeated slowly. The bluntness of his statement didn't quite capture it. "It's more about exploring connections and reigniting that passion. We'd still be committed to each other, just open to new experiences." Gavin took a long swig of his beer, his eyes never leaving Marin's face. When he spoke again, his voice was steady and calm. "This could be the solution to our problems," Marin said, her conviction wavering in the face of his composure. "We could rediscover ourselves and bring that excitement back to our relationship." Gavin nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I see," Marin said, leaning forward, desperate for more of a reaction. "What do you think?" Gavin said nothing for a moment, then, to Marin's utter bewilderment, he switched the TV back on and turned his attention back to the screen, effectively dismissing her. Marin sat there stunned by his nonchalance. She had expected anger, hurt, maybe even relief, but not this. Eerie calm. "That's it." She pressed, unable to let it go. Gavin glanced at her, his eyes devoid of emotion. "What more is there to say right now? You've given me a lot to think about. We'll discuss it further soon." Marin stood on shaky legs, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. "Okay, thank you for listening." She went to bed, her mind whirling. It hadn't gone at all. Gavin's calmness was unsettling, almost frightening in its intensity. She had trouble sleeping that night. She tossed and turned, hyper-aware of Gavin was there with her, sleeping soundly, his breathing deep and even. Her mind was racing with possibilities. What was he thinking? How could he be so calm about this? What would happen next? Morning came, bringing with it a sense of surreal normalcy. Gavin rose early as usual, showering and dressing without a word. Word got around about their conversation the night before. Marin watched him wearily, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It wasn't until she was halfway through her morning coffee that Gavin finally broached the subject. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, his posture rigid, his face a mask of cold anger. "Divorce," he said without any warning. Marin's mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. "What kind of Gavin are you? I don't understand. Didn't you think I knew about your affair with Seth?" The blood drained from Marin's face, How did you find out? I've known for months. Gavin interrupted, I've watched. You lied to me, you sneaked around behind my back, and now you have the nerve to ask for an open marriage? Moran was taken aback. Gavin, please, we can work this out. I'm sorry, I never meant to. Save it, he snapped, I'm done with your deception. I refuse to be part of this charade any longer. Tears spilled down Moran's cheeks. Please don't do this. We can go to counseling and work through this together. Gavin stood in his chair, scraping harshly against the floor. There's nothing to fix. I'll be filing for a straightforward divorce. There's no need to drag this out any longer than necessary. As he turned to leave, Moran caught a glimpse of something in his eyes. A flash of something cold and calculating that sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just hurt or anger, this was something far more dangerous. Gavin, wait. Can't we at least talk about this? He left, and she was alone with the wreckage of her life. She sank to the floor, ignoring the broken mug and spilled coffee as she sobbed. Everything had fallen apart so quickly in the days that followed. Moran's world continued to crumble. Gavin moved into the guest room. He only spoke to her when he had to. His phone was back, but it felt like he was hiding something. Moran was desperate for comfort, so she turned to Seth. They met in secret, stealing moments in his car or secluded corners of parks. Even as Seth held her and whispered reassurances, Moran couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Moran couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She confided in Seth one afternoon, saying, Gavin's acting so strange. He's too calm. It's like he's planning something. Seth stroked her hair soothingly, saying, You're just paranoid. He's probably in shock, trying to process everything. Moran couldn't shake off her unease. She caught Gavin watching her with an unsettling intensity, asking pointed questions about her plans and her relationship with Seth. Each time, his voice remained eerily calm, his face a mask of indifference. I'm scared, Seth Moran admitted. I feel like I'm trapped in some kind of nightmare. Seth pulled her close, offering her a sense of comfort and security. He reassured her that everything would be okay once the divorce was final, and that they could be together openly. Moran nodded against his chest, wanting to believe him. However, as she drove home that evening, her sense of dread only grew. She couldn't shake the feeling. Gavin was clearly several steps ahead of her, orchestrating some elaborate plan she couldn't begin to fathom as she pulled into the driveway. She knew she was in for another tense evening in the house she once called home. Little did she know the true nightmare was only just beginning. Moran's fingers trembled as she applied her lipstick in a deep red, a stark contrast to her pale, drawn face. Tonight was the night, a secret meeting with Seth at the Lux Hotel downtown. She glanced at his reflection, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. You can do this, she whispered to herself, straightening her shoulders as she crept. Moran's heart was beating so fast she was sure Gavin would hear it from the study. She paused at the bottom, listening. The house was silent, just as her hand touched the doorknob. Gavin's voice rang out behind her. I'm meeting some friends, she said, turning around. She could feel guilt etched across her face. Gavin leaned against the door frame, his eyes cold and calculating. Friends or a friend, singular. Seth perhaps? The color drained from Moran's face. Gavin, I save it. He cut her off. His voice was eerily calm. You've made your choice. Moran stood in the study, frozen, her hand still on the doorknob. Part of her wanted to run after him to beg for forgiveness, but the thought of Seth waiting for her, of feeling alive again, propelled her forward. The drive to the hotel was a blur of street lights and racing thoughts. Moran kept glancing in her rearview mirror. Moran was half expecting to see Gavin following her, but there was nothing but the usual evening traffic. Seth was waiting for her in the lobby, his face lighting up as she approached. You made it, he said, pulling her into a tight embrace. Moran melted into his arms, inhaling his familiar scent. I wasn't sure I would, she said. Gavin admitted that he knew I was leaving to meet you. Seth pulled back, concern etched across his face. I don't know how. Marin shook her head, but he didn't try to stop me, he just let me go. Maybe he's finally accepting it's over. Seth suggested, leading her towards the elevators. Marin nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling. She had an uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach. Maybe it was the hotel room, which was luxurious with plush carpets and soft lighting. Seth wasted no time pulling Marin close and kissing her passionately for a moment. Marin let herself get lost in the sensation and pushed away all thoughts of Gavin and the mess she'd made. Of her life, I've been thinking, Seth murmured between kisses. Once your divorce is final, we should take a trip, just the two of us, start fresh. Marin pulled back slightly, searching his eyes. You mean that? Seth nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I love you, Marin. I want a real future. The word sent a thrill. A pang of guilt shot through her, but she pushed it aside. I love you too, she whispered, but let's just focus on tonight. I need to forget, she admitted. Make me forget everything but you. Seth was more than happy to oblige. Their lovemaking was passionate, urgent, and filled with desire. With whispered promises and declarations of love, but as they lay tangled in the sheets afterwards, reality began to creep back in. We should order some champagne, Seth suggested, reaching for the room service menu. Let's celebrate properly, Marin nodded, forcing a smile. That sounds perfect, Seth called down to room service. She excused herself to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face to calm her racing thoughts. Something fell off, but she couldn't put her finger on what. When she emerged, Seth was pouring 2 glasses of champagne. He handed one to her with a flourish and toasted, to new beginnings. Marin clinked her glass against his. She took a long sip and the bubbles tickled her nose, making her feel a little dizzy. Wow, that went straight to my head, she laughed. Seth grinned and pulled her close. Good, let's forget about everything else and just enjoy tonight, he said. But as they kissed again, Marin felt the room begin to spin. Her limbs felt heavy and uncooperative. Seth, she slurred, I don't feel right. The last thing she saw before consciousness was claimed by darkness was Seth's face twisted in an expression she couldn't quite read. Marin's head pounded as consciousness slowly returned. She tried to lift her hand to rub her eyes, but something stopped her. She was suddenly overcome with panic as she realized she couldn't move her arms. Her eyes flew open, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights. This wasn't the hotel room she remembered, it was a hospital. Her mouth felt dry and cottony, and she could see a nurse looking down at her with a mix of concern and weariness. Mrs. Lawson, can you hear me? Marin nodded, wincing at the movement. What happened? Where's Seth? The nurse's expression tightened. Mrs. Lawson, do you remember anything about last night? Marin's brow furrowed as she tried to piece together her fragmented memories. The hotel. She felt dizzy and fuzzy. Where was she? Why couldn't she move her arms? The nurse stepped back, revealing a police officer. Marin hadn't noticed him before. He stepped forward, his face grim. Marin, I'm Officer Reeves. You're under arrest. For what? Marin couldn't understand why Officer Reeves was so cold and professional about the attempted murder of Seth Donovan. Seth was in a coma, and it seemed like all the evidence pointed to her as the attacker. Marin felt like her world was tilting on its axis. Seth was in a coma, and she was the attacker. She whispered, No, there has to be some mistake. I would never do this. For your lawyer, Officer Reeves said, for now, you're to stay here under guard until you're cleared for transfer to the detention center. As the reality of her situation sank in, Marin began to hyperventilate. Please, she begged, I need to call my husband. Gavin will know what to do. He can help me. The nurse stepped forward to help. I'm going to adjust something on the table to try to calm you down, Mrs. Lawson. We'll see about contacting your husband once the doctor has cleared you to eat, but as the sedative took effect, dragging her back into unconsciousness, Marin couldn't shake the image of Gavin's cold, knowing eyes as she left the house. What if he didn't seem keen to help her? What if he was actually glad she was in this mess? The next few days passed in a blur of police interrogations, visits from her court-appointed lawyer, and endless hours of staring at the ceiling trying to piece together what had happened. But no matter how hard she tried, Marin couldn't remember. After the first glass of champagne, Mrs. Lawson and her lawyer, a woman called Janet, spoke to Marin during one of their meetings. They said, "I need you to understand the gravity of your situation. Mr. Donovan was found brutally beaten in your hotel room. Your fingerprints were on the weapon you were found with. The prosecution has a strong case against you." Marin shook her head vehemently, but she insisted she was innocent. She loved Seth and would never hurt him. Janet's expression softened slightly. "I believe you, but we're in a difficult position without concrete evidence to the contrary." Gavin, Marin asked desperately, "Has anyone spoken to him? He must be worried sick." Janet's face showed a strange look. "Mr. Lawson has been uncooperative. He's refusing to speak with the police or to me. I'm sorry, but it seems he's distancing himself from your case entirely." Mar felt as if she'd been punched in the gut. Gavin was turning his back on her after everything they'd been through. She needed to speak with him. "Please, can you get a message to him?" Janet nodded reluctantly. "I'll try, but Mrs. Lawson, we need to focus on your defense. Is there anything at all you can remember that might help us?" Marin closed her eyes, trying. She tried to focus, but all she saw was darkness, and she felt that overwhelming dizziness. "I'm sorry, I can't remember anything," she whispered. Janet gathered her papers to leave, and a nurse entered the room. "Mrs. Lawson, this came for you," she said, handing Marin a small, unmarked box. Marin's heart leapt. Could it be from Gavin? He finally decided to help her, his hands trembling as he handed her the box. Inside was a folded note, her wedding ring, and a USB drive. Marin unfolded the note, her fingers shaking as she read Gavin's neat handwriting. 5 simple words were written there: "Watch this, and you'll understand." Janet asked, pausing at the door. Marin clutched the box to her chest. "Is it from my husband?" she asked. "Is there any way I can? I'll show you what's on this USB." Janet paused, then nodded. "I'll take a look and see what I can do. Just wait there, Mrs. Lawson. I'll be back soon." As the door closed behind her, Marin stared at the USB drive, feeling a mix of hope and dread swirling in her stomach. What could be on it? Evidence to clear her name or something far worse? It felt like hours before Janet returned with a laptop. "You have 30 minutes, she said. I set it up on the small table beside Marin's bed. "I'll be right outside if you need me to step out." Marin inserted the USB drive with trembling hands. A video file popped up, and she hit play. Her heart pounded as the screen flickered to life, showing a familiar hotel room. Marin's breath caught as she saw herself and Seth laughing and kissing as they entered the frame. She watched transfixed as the scene played out with them embracing and toasting with champagne, but then the video cut abruptly. Marin's heart started racing. There was Gavin sitting calmly in what looked like their home office. He stared directly into the camera, his eyes cold and determined. "Hello, Marin," his voice rang out. It was steady and emotionless. "By now, you've probably realized that things aren't quite what they seem. Let me fill you in on what happened next." Marin watched in horror as Gavin methodically laid out his plan. He described in chilling detail how he had orchestrated everything, drugging her drink, assaulting Seth, planting evidence that pointed to her. "As you see," Gavin's voice continued, a hint of satisfaction creeping in. "I've been planning this for months, ever since I first discovered your little affair. You really thought I wouldn't notice? I would never just roll over and accept your betrayal." Tears streamed down Marin's face as she watched Gavin explain each step of his revenge. He said he'd waited for her to ask for an open marriage, knowing it would be the perfect trigger to set his plan in motion. He'd also carefully timed everything, ensuring she would black out at the critical moment. Gavin smirked. Your fingerprints are on the weapon you were found with. It's the perfect frame job, if I do say so myself. The video shows Gavin cleaning up the hotel room and planting false evidence. Moran felt her heart beat faster as she watched him calmly. By the time you see this, it'll be too late. You'll be facing charges, your reputation will be in tatters, and I'll be free of you and our sham of a marriage. This is the price of your betrayal, Moran. I hope it was worth it. The screen went black, leaving Moran staring at her own shocked reflection. She barely registered Janet Rhee as she entered the room, she barely heard Janet's concerned questions. All she could focus on was the crushing realization of just how thoroughly Gavin had beaten her. Mrs. Lawson, Moran, Janet's voice finally broke through the fog. What was on the drive? Was it helpful? Moran turned to her lawyer. Her eyes were hollow. It was Gavin, she whispered. He did this. He set me up. Janet's brow furrowed. Your husband framed you. Do you have proof? That's when Moran realized the full horror of Gavin's plan. The USB drive was just a silent confession and didn't help her case. There was no proof it wasn't fabricated and no way to verify its contents. It was just another taunt and a final twist of the knife. No proof, just his word against mine, as Janet began outlining their limited options. Moran tuned her out and stared at the blank screen. Gavin's? Gavin's cold eyes burned into her memory. How had she never seen this side of him? How had she underestimated him so completely for the first time since this nightmare began? Moran felt the full weight of her situation crash down upon her. She was alone, framed for a horrific crime with no way to prove her innocence. And the man she had once loved, the man she had betrayed, had orchestrated it all with chilling precision. As the reality of her situation sank in, Moran felt something inside her break. She curled up in a ball, sobbing uncontrollably as the full impact of Gavin's revenge became clear. This wasn't just about destroying her marriage or her relationship with Seth, he had systematically dismantled her entire life, leaving her with nothing but the consequences of her own choices. The walls of the hospital room seemed to as Moran faced the terrifying truth, she realized there was no easy way out of this nightmare. Gavin had won and she was left to face a future she could never have imagined. The harsh fluorescent lights of the detention center buzzed incessantly, grating on Moran's already frayed nerves. She sat across from Janet, her lawyer, who was shuffling through a stack of papers with a grim expression. Moran began, her voice carefully neutral. I've reviewed all the evidence, and I have to be honest with you, it doesn't look good. Gavin's confession aside, there's still the USB drive. It's the truth, Moran said, her voice rising in desperation. I believe you, Janet said, holding up a hand to calm her client. But belief isn't enough in a court of law. We need hard evidence, and right now, all the physical evidence points to you. Moran slumped back in her chair, the weight of her situation crushing down on her. So what do we do? Janet hesitated, then met Moran's eyes with a serious expression. The prosecution has offered a plea deal if you plead guilty to aggravated assault. They're willing to drop the attempted murder charge. Moran whispered, shocked. I didn't do it, she said. I know. But if this goes to trial, the plea deal would mean a significantly reduced sentence. Moran shook her head vehemently. No, Janet said, I know you're trying to protect me, but I can't plead guilty to something I didn't do. There has to be another way. Mrs. Lawson Moran, I understand how you feel, but I need you to understand the reality of your situation. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Your fingerprints are on the weapon. You were at the scene. You were also involved with the victim, and now with Mr. Donovan, who is still in a coma. Moran let out a soft, guilty moan. Has there been any change in his condition? Janet shook her head. No, the doctors are still unsure if he'll regain consciousness. Moran closed her eyes, fighting back tears. This can't be happening. It just can't. I'm sorry, Janet said, her voice full of genuine sympathy. I know this is difficult, but we need to make a decision about the plea deal soon. Moran opened her eyes and looked at Janet with a sudden fire blazing in them. No, I won't give up, there has to be something we're missing, some way to prove Gavin did this. Janet sighed and gathered her papers. I'll keep looking, but I can't promise anything in the meantime. Please consider the plea deal. It might be your best option. The room felt more claustrophobic than ever. She paced the limited space, her mind racing. Surely there had to be a way out of this nightmare. Surely there had to be days blurred together, each one bringing more bad news. Seth's condition remained unchanged. The media frenzy around her case grew, painting her as a violent, jealous woman who had snapped when her affair was exposed. Even her friends and family seemed to be turning away, believing the evidence against her was mounting. It was during one particularly bleak afternoon that a guard appeared at her cell door. "Lawson, you have a visitor." Maren's heart leapt. Could it be Gavin finally coming to confess, or maybe Seth had woken up and could clear her name? But as she was led to the visitation room, she saw a familiar face that made her blood run cold. Detective Moore, the lead investigator on her case, sat there. Mrs. Lawson told her that he was waiting for her. He greeted her in a gruff voice and told her to have a seat. Maren sat across from him, her hands shaking slightly. Moore leaned forward and told her to look at the facts. He said, "I'll cut to the chase. We've been doing some digging and some interesting information has come to light." Maren's breath caught. She asked what kind of information it was. Moore told her that it seemed that her husband, Mr. Lawson, had been busy since her arrest. Mo said it in a way that made Maren think. "Large withdrawals from your joint accounts, putting your house on the market." There was a glimmer of hope in Maren's chest. "He's running because he knows he's guilty." Moore's expression didn't change. "That's one theory. Another is that he's distancing himself from a wife he believes to be guilty of a horrible crime." "No," Maren insisted, leaning forward. "Detective, please. You have proof of this. I need you to believe me. Gavin set me up. He planned all of this, and you have proof of it." Mo asked, raising an eyebrow. Maren deflated slightly. "The USB drive, yes, the conveniently delivered confession." I nodded, which I might add, our tech team says could easily have been fabricated. But why would I fabricate something like that? For the first time, Moore looked like he was considering the possibility that Gavin was telling the truth. "It's an elaborate story, I'll give you that." Maren pressed on, "Detective, please. I'd like to look into Gavin's background a bit more. There might be something in the security footage from near our house. Maybe something to show he wasn't home when he said he was." She studied him for a long moment, then stood. "I can't make any promises, Mrs. Lawson, but I'll see what I can do." Left, Maren felt a tiny spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Janet visited more frequently, updating Maren on the latest developments. The police were looking more closely at Gavin's movements, but so far nothing concrete had emerged. "He's too smart," Maren said, pacing her small cell during one of Janet's visits. "He would have covered his tracks," Janet nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're probably right, but Detective Mia seems to be taking your claims more seriously now. That's something, at least." Maren stopped pacing and turned to face her lawyer. "What about Seth?" Janet's face softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry, Maren. There's been no improvement. The doctors aren't optimistic about his chances of waking up." The words hit Maren like a physical blow. She sank onto her cot, her head and her hands between her knees. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't started that affair, it wouldn't have happened," she said quietly. "You made a mistake, yes, but you didn't do this. You didn't hurt Seth. Remember that." Maren nodded, trying to hold on to that truth as her world continued to crumble around her. 2 days later, everything changed. Maren was picking at her unappetizing lunch when a guard appeared at her cell door. "You got a visitor," he said. "Important." Maren's heart lifted as she was led to the visitation room. Who could it be? As she entered, she saw Detective Moore waiting for her. His face was unreadable. Mrs. Lawson greeted her. "Please," he said. Marin complied, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "What's going on, Detective Moore?" Moore took a deep breath. "We've had a breakthrough in your case, Mr. Donovan." "Seth. He's awake." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Seth's awake." Marin gasped. "Is he okay? What did he say?" "He's still weak, but he was able to give a statement." "Mrs. Lawson, he backs up what you said. He says the last thing he remembers is feeling dizzy after drinking champagne. He has no memory of you attacking him." Marin was so relieved, she started crying. "So you believe me now? You know I didn't do this." Moore held a hand. "It's not that simple. His statement alone isn't enough to clear you entirely, but it has cast significant doubt on the prosecution's case." "Marin, what about Gavin Marin?" "Moore, have you found anything on him?" Marin, "Well, actually, we have. We started looking more closely and found some inconsistencies in his alibi for that night. There's also something else." He pulled out a folder and slid across the table. Marin's breath caught as she recognized the Lux Hotel. "This is security footage from the night of the attack. Take a closer look at the figure entering the service entrance." Marin squinted at the grainy image. The figure was blurry, but there was something familiar about the way they moved their shoulders. "Is that right?" she whispered. Moore nodded grimly. "We believe so. It's not conclusive, but combined with the holes in his alibi and Mr. Donovan's statement, it's enough for us to bring Mr. Lawson in for questioning." Relief flooded through Marin so intensely she felt lightheaded. "So, what happens now?" "We'll find your husband," Mo said, standing. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Marin was released on bail, but the charges against her were suspended pending further investigation. She really wanted to visit Seth in the hospital to apologize and explain, but her lawyer advised against it. "Let's wait until this is all sorted out," Janet advised. "We don't want to give the prosecution any ammunition." Marin nodded reluctantly, focusing instead on helping the police in their search for Gavin. However, as days turned into weeks with no sign of him, a creeping dread began to set in. "He's gone," she told Janet during one of their meetings. From their meetings, he knew we were getting close. He ran, and Janet's expression was grim. It was looking that way, but the police were still searching. They'd frozen his accounts, flagged his passport, he couldn't hide forever. But as more time passed, it seemed that Gavin might have done just that. The trail went cold, the media frenzy around the case started to die down. Marin found herself in a strange limbo, no longer in jail but not truly free either. It was a month after her release when the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Marin was at home, not the house she had shared with Gavin, but a small apartment Janet had helped her find. When there was a knock at the door, she opened it to find Detective Moore standing there, looking a bit confused. "Mrs. Lawson said, may I come in?" "I have some difficult news." He handed her an envelope. Marin opened it and pulled out a single photograph. She recognized Gavin smiling on a tropical beach, a drink in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. "What is this?" she whispered. "That photo was sent to the precinct." "Morning," Moore explained. He also handed her another envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, divorce papers, signed by Gavin. "I don't understand," Marin said, her voice shaking. "Where is he? Why hasn't he been arrested?" Moore's expression was a mix of frustration and begrudging admiration. "We've confirmed that photo," he said. The photo was taken on a small private island in the Caribbean, which has no extradition treaty with the United States. The full impact of what he was saying hit Marin like a tidal wave. "He's gone," she whispered. "There's nothing we can do." M nodded grimly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Lawson. We're still building a case and searching for concrete evidence. We need concrete evidence, but without him here to face charges." Marin sank onto her couch, the photo and divorce papers clutched in her hands. "So that's it, he just gets away with it for now." Moore said, his voice hardening, "but we won't stop looking. We'll catch him eventually. They promised to keep her updated on any developments. Moran stared at the photo of Gavin, his smile mocking her. She thought of Seth, still in hospital, of her ruined reputation, her lost home, her shattered life. Gavin had not just destroyed her marriage or her relationship with Seth, he had taken her entire world apart piece by piece, leaving her to put it back together again while he enjoyed a relaxing break on a beach, free from any consequences. The next day, despite her lawyer's advice to the contrary, Moran visited Seth in the hospital. He was pale and weak, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "I'm sorry, I should have known you'd never." She shook her head, taking his hand. "No, I'm the one who's sorry. This is all my fault. If I hadn't started the affair." Seth squeezed her hand weakly. "We both made mistakes, but what Gavin did is unforgivable." Mar nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was so blind. I never saw that side." They spent hours talking about what had happened that night, but in the end, they were left with more questions than answers. As Moran was about to leave, Seth took her hand. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. She paused for a moment, then said, "I don't know, my life is completely different now," she added. "I have to start over somehow." Seth nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Whatever you decide, I'm here if you want me to be." Moran gave him a small smile and a thank you, but said she needed to figure things out on her own for a while as she left the hospital. She felt a range of emotions, including anger at Gavin's escape, fear for an uncertain future, and, underneath it all, a glimmer of hope or determination. She thought of Gavin, sipping cocktails on his tropical beach, thinking he had won, and made a silent vow to rebuild her life stronger than before, someday, somehow. She would find a way to bring him to justice as she stepped out into the sunlight. Moran took a deep breath. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in months, she felt ready to face it one step at a time. She would reclaim her life, untangling the web of deceit that had nearly destroyed her.